We're rolling. First, say your first and last name and spell it and your title.
Okay. John Bossenbroek, Jon, and then Bossenbroek is Bossenbroek. I'm an associate professor in the environmental sciences department as well as the Lake Erie Center at the University of Toledo.
All right, John. And over the last couple of years, we've been having this invading issue of Asian carp coming into the Great Lakes. Is there any update on it? Where are we standing on that?
Yeah, so interestingly, where I did my postdoc work was at the University of Notre Dame and working with Dr. David Lodge, and it's his lab, him and his postdocs and graduate students that were the ones to find the DNA evidence in and around the electric barrier a couple years ago now. And so they've been continually doing that work. One of the things they've been looking at is trying to see if they're finding evidence of Asian carp in the Great Lakes. So they've gone out and gotten a lot of samples from Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and so forth. And at this point, they've found no evidence of it outside of the Calumet River area and the shipping canals around Chicago. And that's work that's ongoing. And they have some samples from Lake Erie. They haven't processed those yet. So I was just talking to one of their researchers, Chris Jurdy, earlier today, trying to get updated about it as well. So that's kind of the current status. So as far as we know, there aren't populations above the electric barrier in Lake Michigan. There are some other pathways to get into the Great Lakes. One is the live fish trade. So Asian markets like to be able to sell live carp. And I think just a couple weeks ago there was an article in the Detroit Free Press about Border Patrol stopping shipments of live carp from U.S. to Canada for the Toronto and Montreal live fish trade markets. And so that's definitely an additional problem besides the shipping canal. And there's also the potential of a wetlands connection between the Wabash River and the Maumee. So people have been watching the Wabash River as well in Indiana. And as far as I know, the closest anybody's found of Asian carp to that wetland system is about 100 miles, 70 to 100 miles.
What do you see in the future? Is this going to continue to be a problem? Will the Asian carp problem subside, or could it possibly get into the Great Lakes?
It certainly could possibly get into the Great Lakes. The Army Corps wants to try and convince people that the electric barrier is foolproof, but there are very few things in life that are foolproof. So there's always going to be some probability that something gets through that barrier or some other means, live fish market or so forth. The question is, what can we do to keep that probability really low? And then if we find it, and the other question is, can we establish ways to detect it earlier if it shows up somewhere? Because once things gets established really well, such as zebra mussels, there's no way to get rid of them. So the key now is to set up a system where we can continually monitor and find, if it gets into the Great Lakes, find it earlier so that there are things that we can do. Because once it gets established, the likelihood that you can get rid of it once it's established are very low. So I think that's probably where things are headed now. There's big questions about how good some of the lakes are as habitat for Asian carp. There's several different species. We kind of group them as one. Lake Michigan, some people don't think it's going to be that great a habitat, but on the flip side, Lake Erie, most every fish biologist says Lake Erie would be a wonderful habitat for these fish. They do typically reproduce in rivers, and so we have a nice big Maumee River for them to reproduce in. They're very productive. We've had the algal blooms, and we have so much production here, so it would be a very good place for Asian carp to do well. So we definitely don't want them in Lake Erie.
Yeah, that was pretty much my next question. If they get into Lake Michigan, could they? I'd imagine. I really haven't heard of anything. Could an Asian carp survive a northern Michigan winter in Lake Michigan, northern Lake Huron, Lake Superior?
Lake Superior is one thing. I don't think they'd have any problem surviving, especially in adults in lower Lake Michigan, even northern Lake Michigan. I think the biggest question that people have is whether they can reproduce in those systems. I think all the studies about where Asian carp have reproduced have been in river systems, and the hypothesis is that they have, that their eggs need to continually roll or move, so they can't get settled, otherwise they get buried by sediments. And so rivers are a good way to do that. So one question would be, if they get into Lake Michigan, there are some currents in Lake Michigan, would those currents be enough to keep those eggs from being damaged and keep them afloat or what have you until they hatch? You know, and that's why one of the questions is, can they skip from one river system to the other? I mean, there's other river systems around the Great Lakes, the Maumee being a great one and a big one for them. And so I think it's more that question rather than temperature that would drive this issue.
How would this impact fishing business going down the road for us, especially you know, like perch, walleye, just your normal run-of-the-mill Great Lakes fishing?
Yeah, again, I'm not a fisheries biologist, so
okay.
The overall, the impact on the food chain, that they've drastically changed the community dynamics in the Mississippi River. They feed low on the food chain, so they take up food resources for the higher up on the food chain. So how much they would remove food resources for perch and walleye, I mean, that's the big concern. And there have been some other larger carnivore or higher food chain level fishes in the Mississippi River that have gone down, supposedly because of this. So I think that is a major concern, that they will take away some of those or use up some of those resources on the lower levels of the food chain, where walleye, our big fish here, big sporting fish here, is the top of the food chain. And if you start knocking down some of the bottom, then that removes resources for the walleye. So that's the biggest concern.
Gotcha. Would lake levels or river levels, the fluctuation impact them in their way to survive?
That way, I don't have.
Okay.
No.
Let's see. And then real quick, I just cutting away from Asian carp. I just want to jump to zebra mussels real quick, because even I'm wondering about this question. I wanted to ask you. How's this season looking out? Have we plateaued with the zebra mussels, you think? What we have is what we got, pretty much? Am I going to be scraping my outer motor again this fall, pretty much?
Most likely.
Okay.
And that's the thing. So there's actually most of the mussels that we call zebra mussels in Lake Erie now are closely related species called the quagga mussel, which showed up about 10 years after. And it's pretty much taken over for zebra mussels in Lake Erie. So most of those mussels that we find now in Lake Erie are actually what are called quagga mussels. They look the same, unless you're an expert. I can often not tell them apart. And they're starting to move into some of the other lakes. Most of the inland lakes, still, if you find zebra mussels, they are actually zebra mussels. But
Gotcha.
they're an organism that's pretty much here to stay, unless, of course, a new disease or parasite or something like that. I mean, we have fish that eat them, but not enough amount to reduce their populations.
So you're telling me I'm scraping away again this fall?
Yeah, most likely.
Is there any other invasive species that we should be concerned about in the Great Lakes? Not so much the Asian carp or the zebra mussels. Is there any sneak attack, that we should be worried about?
Well, there's stuff that's already in the Great Lakes and stuff that's not here yet. I mean, so one that's been up in Duluth Harbor is the Eurasian ruff, so another fish species. It's starting to move along the southern shore of Lake Superior. I think it's been found in Huron and maybe on the southern edge of the Upper Peninsula as well, in Lake Michigan. And that's a fish species. Again, what kind of impacts it'll have, we don't know, but that's one that seems to be working its way here. On the line of zebra mussels, there's a species called the golden mussel, which is bigger, and some people say badder than the zebra mussel. It's not here yet. You find it in South America. And I think people would be really concerned if that showed up here. So that's one that people are really keeping on their radar to keep track of, see where it is, how it gets moved around and things like that, to see if the possibility that it shows up here, because people are concerned if it does show up here, it will be worse than zebra mussels.
Doctor, you have anything else to add? Or?
I guess the issue with an invasive species, it's really about preventing things getting into some place. Once they're here, especially aquatic systems, once they're in a system, it's very hard to get rid of them. So a lot of the research that I do and other people do are looking at how they get moved around. And so if we can understand and keep them from getting moved around, that's our best prevention. So keeping things out of the Great Lakes is the first step, because once they're into the Great Lakes, it's really difficult to get them out.
All right. Thank you very much. much.
Sure.